The $64,000 question that a lot of people have asked is, what language did Jesus speak?
Yes.
And in a sense, that's kind of the wrong question. In other words, you and I went to South Africa, and we met people who spoke 3 or 4 languages.
And there's 11 official.
What's that?
There are 11 official.
That's right, 11 official languages.
Yeah.
Our perspective, our Eurocentric perspective is that who learns multiple languages? The common man is off working in factories and in fields. He doesn't have time to learn languages. The people who learn multiple languages are people who have leisure time. They sit down with their tutor, and the tutor recites to them the Latin and recites to them the Greek, and they learn multiple languages, and then they travel through France, and the languages they learn, the language of French they learn, they get to practice it. So our assumption, coming from a European cultural background, is, and by us I mean the United States, right?
Yes.
People in Western civilization, our assumption is that people who have leisure time are the people who learn multiple languages. When you go to the third world, you find out that's not true. Even some countries that aren't the third world. In China, I would meet people who spoke their local language, who spoke fluent Mandarin, and usually spoke another language that was used in commerce in the area from the neighboring village. And all of those would be defined by linguists as mutually unintelligible languages, sometimes dialects, right? But really mutually unintelligible languages. The local language where I lived in China was more different than Mandarin than Hebrew and Aramaic are. Hebrew and Aramaic are sister languages. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of words that are in common between the two languages, and actually between all Semitic languages, or many Semitic languages. So for example, the word for child in Hebrew is yeled. In Aramaic, it's yalad. And in Aramaic, it's walad. Right? It's the same word, same 3 consonants, except for the first consonant in Arabic becomes a wa, and in Hebrew it's a ya. We have the same phenomenon, by the way, happening in Hebrew with the name chaya, or the word chaya, which means life, and the woman's name derived from that is Chava, right, which is the vav. Right, so vav, yud interchanges. We have that in the name Yehovah, by the way, haya, hoveh, hieh, in the 3 forms of the verb. So the point is, you look across Semitic languages and you see hundreds of words, thousands of words in common, and even what's called the morphology of the grammar is very, very similar. So first of all, in the Galilee, people spoke, no question about it. They spoke Hebrew, they spoke Greek, and they spoke Aramaic. All 3 languages were spoken in the Galilee. If you went to Scythopolis, which was the ancient city of Beit Sha'an, which had been populated and settled by Greeks, and it became a Greek city, or Greek-speaking people at least. It was settled by Greek-speaking people. They spoke Greek in Beit Sha'an. If you had Jews out in the villages around Beit Sha'an, they probably spoke Hebrew, and then you had other people who spoke Aramaic. So to ask the question, which language did Yeshua speak, is like saying somebody in the village they call them the townships in South Africa, which of the languages do they speak? Now you can ask, okay, what's their mother tongue? Meaning what language does their mother speak? But their father might speak a different language.
Exactly.
Right? And we encountered people like that. There's this famous statement of Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is a really interesting figure, and we're going to get back to him. So he lived and died in the Galilee. He spent his whole life in the Galilee. He's known in Jewish history because around the year, sometime between the year 189 and 210, he compiled a great compilation of Jewish teachings, of rabbinical teachings, which became known as the Mishnah. Some people call him the author of the Mishnah, but he didn't write the Mishnah. He collected these different teachings and sayings, which became the Mishnah. And then what the Talmud does is it says, well, what about this other statement that Rabbi Judah the Prince didn't include in the Mishnah? It says something different attributed to a similar rabbi or a different rabbi, right? So the Talmud is actually hashing out the teachings that Rabbi Judah the Prince didn't include in the Mishnah. This is in the Babylonian Talmud, Baba Kama 82b. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince says, in the land of Israel, why speak Aramaic? Speak either Hebrew or Greek. And he takes it as a given that you can speak all 3 languages, right? In his household, he says, we want to speak Greek. We don't want to speak Aramaic. Why not Aramaic? Aramaic was understood to be the language of the heathens. There were Jews who spoke Aramaic. The Targum, which is the ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah and then later of the prophets and writings, is Aramaic. But there are also people who spoke Greek. They also had the ability to speak Hebrew. The passage in Baba Kama goes on and they say, well, what if you live in Babylonia? What language should you speak? Should you speak Aramaic? Because Aramaic is the native language of Babylonia. They say, no, don't speak Aramaic. Speak either Persian or Hebrew. Why Persian? Because they were living under Persian rule, and it was the language of the Persian Empire. If you can't speak Hebrew, then speak Persian, but don't speak the language of the heathens, Aramaic. Aramaic was really looked down upon. There were still people who spoke Aramaic, no question about it. Really, we have to think of it in terms of all three languages were spoken. And so the question is, which language did Yeshua speak is the wrong question. He spoke all three languages. He would have spoken different languages and different opportunities.
Can you help us with something, Nehemia? So one of the things that happened, I remember this, I was in Namibia, and I was all excited because every time I go to a place, I like to learn a little bit of the language that's there, etc. But I was on my way from Namibia to Johannesburg on a South African Airlines, and I remember this so clearly. So I had learned a little bit of Afrikaans in Namibia. When I get on the airplane on my way to Johannesburg, I decided to greet the South African flight attendant in Afrikaans. And the response was a bit negative. Now, I wasn't taking into context why it would be different for the person that's in Johannesburg to feel differently about me coming to speak to them in the language of Afrikaans. Now, the reason I'm bringing that as an example, I want to ask a question back to the time.
That's a great example. That is a great example because there's often a ideological connotation or attachment to specific languages. Like famously in South Africa, there were riots and protests because they wanted to teach the Black African population Afrikaans in their schools and not English. And they said, no, we won't be able to communicate with the people of the world. English is the international language and one of the languages of South Africa. Why should we learn Afrikaans?
And by the way, the people that were at that point teaching them to them, also they looked at from a perspective of oppression. The list goes on
absolutely.
And on. So here's my question.
In other words, it was used specifically to cut them off from the people of the world. That was, and it had an ideological connotation to it.
So here's my question, and this is an important one, and this is what happened for me. And I thought, man, I'm gonna ask Nehemia this because you'll be able to answer it. So in the Galilee, what does Aramaic mean historically? What does Greek mean historically? And of course, what does Hebrew mean? Now, you don't have to answer all three of those, but at least with Aramaic, can we just take a minute to ask what would it have meant historically? Like, what would be the meaning in terms of its background?
So Aram is the name of a people, one of the peoples who are mentioned in the peoples list in Genesis 10. Aram was a descendant of Ever, meaning from what we get the word Hebrew, but he spoke a different language. There were three major Aramean kingdoms in, let's say, in the time of the first temple period and before. There were three major Aramean kingdoms. There were Aram Damascus, that is the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, Aram Tsova, which is today Aleppo, that is Aram of the city of Tsova, of Aleppo. And then there was Aram Naharaim, Aram between the two rivers, which we call today Iraq or Mesopotamia. And so the language, we know that we say that Abraham came from Aram Naharaim, so there's a question. I say we know. There's a question, did he speak Aramaic or did he speak Hebrew? There's no question what Laban spoke. Laban spoke Aramaic. And how do we know Laban spoke Aramaic? Because when he makes a covenant with Jacob, they make a pile of stones, and we're told that Jacob calls it Gal Ed, which means a pile as a witness, and Laban calls it Yagar Sahaduta. Yagar Sahaduta means a pile of testimony, right? It's not actually even the same name. And it tells us that in Genesis, that Laban had a different name for it because Laban spoke a different language. So by the time of Jacob, we can say with complete confidence, people were speaking Hebrew. Whether Abraham spoke Aramaic or Hebrew or both, I guess we don't really know that. But definitely by the time of Jacob, Hebrew was the language. And then Hebrew, of course, was the language that was spoken with different dialects. And we'll get to that in a second. With different dialects all the way up until around the 9th century. We quote in our book, A Prayer to Our Father, I believe we quote, from a rabbi named Rabbi Elijah ben Judah the Nazarite, who wrote what's considered the first grammar of Hebrew. And there he says he sits in the public squares and the streets of or the markets of Tiberias to listen to the speech of the common folk,
Yes.
so he can fill in some of the blanks in his grammar. Or his grammar was based on the Hebrew of the Bible, but not everything that existed in ancient Hebrew is in the Bible. Meaning, imagine if we didn't know a word of English and all we had of English was the writings of Shakespeare. So there's a lot more to English than what's in Shakespeare. And so he had to hear from the common folk and hear them speak to know what some of the rules were as late as the 9th century, which is pretty incredible, or maybe even the beginning of the 10th century.